Hello, welcome everybody to the Abbey Museum's virtual program today, Stitching Ourselves Together, a critical look at museum and tribal collaboration. I'm joined here today by Jennifer Pictou. I'm Starr, and we're really happy to have you here with us. This is a program in a series of programs that we've been doing for over a year now, actually. It's part of our Indigenous Methodologies program, a program that looks at a variety of Indigenous-led efforts in many different fields, from archaeology to education, museum studies. We've had a number of guest speakers throughout this series, and I'm really happy today to be looking inward at the Abbey and to also be a little bit reflective in the work that we've been doing here and with Jennifer on on the Mi'kmaq Porcupine Revival Project and also within the actual exhibit that we produced together. I do want to remind you that if you would like to learn more about the upcoming programs that we have scheduled for this season, please visit us at abbeymuseum.org for all of that information. We're going to start sharing right now. So later on, at the end of our program, we're actually going to be taking questions from the audience. So if you'd like to use the Q&A box function, that is where we're going to be taking all of the questions at the end of our presentation today. But I want to start by introducing myself. My name is Starr. I'm the curator of education here at the Abbey Museum. So I lead all of our school programming, a lot of the curriculum work that we do with districts throughout the state of Maine. I'm also the lead staff curator for this show, Stitching Ourselves Together. I come from a background of education, classroom education, actually. So that's how I approach my work in the museum and also the work that I do throughout the state. I am a citizen of Kitigan-Zibi-Anishinaabe, which is a First Nation up in Canada. I come to this work with a lot of experience and a lot of research that I did both in my undergraduate and my graduate at Colgate University around decolonizing methodologies and indigenizing methodologies, especially within education. And it really has given me a good foundation for approaching this work and doing this work in good faith with a bunch of different Wabanaki advisors and teachers and educators throughout the state. And I'm going to allow Jennifer the space to introduce herself at this time.
Thank you, Starr. Gosh, I don't know how to follow that. That was really good. My name is Jennifer. I am a member of the Mi'kmaq Nation in Presque Isle, Maine. I am the former Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. I held that job for 8 years. I come from a background of a lot of museum work. I first started my museum career in 2001, and I have been in museum education ever since. I have also been the executive director, former executive director of the Bangor Museum and History Center. I had an interesting kind of a background as far as art goes. My family has always been into basket making, beadwork, a little bit of quill work, but I've always wanted to know the stories why and how. And I feel like my inquisitive nature has really lent itself to this project in particular. And a lot of my studies, I have a bachelor's degree in fine art, one in cultural anthropology, and I have a master's in American and New England studies from the University of Southern Maine. So I found that I leaned a lot on my background to tease out questions and thought processes and patterns as we developed this exhibit. So I look forward to talking to you about it today.
So here we wanted to provide you a little bit of background on the project that actually happened up at Mi'kmaq Nation in Presque Isle. And this work was led by Jennifer and members of her community. And it was truly a program that was developed by them, and I'll allow Jennifer to talk more about it in just a second. But I wanted to really make that very clear from the beginning that this part of the project was not an Abbey project. You know, we did not put together this project around revitalization. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit once I talk a little bit more about how the Abbey got involved and about collaboration. But I wanted to make sure that we establish that from the beginning that this kind of section isn't necessarily the Abbey coming in and asserting any kind of expertise in this area. But I'll allow Jennifer to speak a little bit more about um, how she started this project.
The project actually started as almost a happy accident, almost. We had been looking at a tribal level. We were looking at getting more funding, but the way grants usually process for us at a tribal level is that we have to have some kind of project. Um, Funders are very unwilling to fund kind of these ephemeral kind of ideas, and they really want something concrete, something that you have a long history of need for, a documented need. And when I was looking through the information for this kind of topic, I also had an overlaying sense that we needed something that really dug into the cultural resource management of the tribe. And for me, cultural resource management didn't necessarily mean the dirt, the rocks, the trees. And even though it does, uh, our our community really feels that people and traditional skills are highly valued cultural resources. So in looking at that kind of topic, what happened was the tribe they had conducted a survey of tribal artisans in 2012. Utilizing the information from that particular set of data, I saw that only one household out of our tribal community could still perform any type of porcupine quillwork embroidery. And that seemed to be something that was critical at the time. We have a lot of basket makers, and that is not as critical as some of the things that we are seeing as far as other types of art going away. Certainly with the emerald ash borer, we take that into consideration. And yes, basketry is very critical. But we were looking at something that we needed to almost reach out and save as part of our community history. And that really fit the bill. It was a sense of urgency when we found that out, that we only had one person, really one person in our entire community in Presque Isle, Caribou, Littleton, in Aroostook County, the top third of Maine, that could perform this particular activity. So it became a very important piece for us to follow through with. So taking that information and finding that it had been documented for years, that we had only one person, looking at that person's age, looking at the viability of this art form continuing in our community, I was able to follow through with funding through the National Park Service under what was called a tribal heritage grant. And tribal heritage grants, they are funding that is set aside mostly for tribes that don't have a THPO, a tribal historic preservation officer, because there's money that comes into that program. Tribal heritage grants are often for the tribes who don't have that position, don't have that funding, but they have critical care needs for their tribal cultural resources as well. If there is money left over, then the tribes with the THPO programs can actually apply for that. So there's no harm in trying, is my thought process on grants. So we tried for this grant and we were funded. We were funded for a number of very important workshops community engagement pieces. We were funded for supplies. We were funded for a lot of things that allowed community members to be able to take the time away from their families or work for a day on a regular basis and be part of this art form in order to create a community of women, which was one of the goals of the grant, was to actually create a community of new artisans based upon the skills that we would learn. One of the biggest challenges that we had in this particular process, and I'm talking the beginning of the process, is we didn't have an instructor. We had no one to teach us. This one person in our community could do it, but she hadn't done it in a really long time. So that left us without someone who was confident to teach others as an instructor. So we reached out and we found the most fabulous instructor that we could have hoped to find, and that was Tara Francis. And I know she's on today. So Tara, you rock. You really saved our bacon on this one. Tara was willing to travel from Canada. So there was a cross-border component in this, which was also critical to our connection as a community on the US side of the border to connect with our sister tribes in Canada. There are only about 1,400 Mi'kmaq on this side of the border that belong to the Mi'kmaq Nation in Presque Isle. And there are about 30,000 Mi'kmaqs in Canada. So to be able to reach out and connect with someone like Tara was a phenomenal experience for us, because there is a lot of cross pollination of ideas across the border that we don't recognize, but the two federal governments do. And that was a whole other issue. So in that, we met our goal. Our number one goal was to find an instructor that would help us. And then we conducted a series of workshops where community members were involved in the learning process. And ultimately, our goals were to develop this group of artisans, which we did despite COVID, because COVID pandemic, that disrupted everything for us. It disrupted our instructors' travel across the border. We could not travel across the border to her. It disrupted a lot of our lives, because then it became very immediate. What were the immediate needs of families and households, as opposed to this art form? And we still kept in contact through this. And one of our goals was to continue meeting the needs of the tribal community and meeting the needs of the grant as it was written. So we developed a private Facebook group that we all kind of got in on, and we would share pictures and we would find things that other artisans had done. Tara was great with keeping us engaged and uplifted, and we enjoyed sharing information back and forth. One of our young tribal ladies designed a logo for us for our group that we now call Quillers of the Dawn. And we have been able to at least keep together virtually, if not in person. And we do plan on meeting in person after this as a sustained group, which was also another one of the goals in the grant, was to be able to do this as a sustained activity. So one of the things that we did is we found out in our challenges that some of our tribal members really weren't quite getting what the whole idea was. And my background in education meant that I was missing the mark somewhere. That meant that I was not engaging with the community, or with those of you in the museum world. I wasn't engaging with the visitor. So I needed to find a way to hook people to get them in. And I happened to know a couple people at the Abbey, and I knew what the Abbey collection contained. And it was an easy reach out, although it was a hard ask to get the Abbey involved. They were willing from day one. And it was an amazing response by a museum to our request. But we needed to connect the collection with the actual tribal community. that did not have the means nor the time in order to travel 4.5 hours downstate to go see our tribal pieces within the environment of a collections room. And I'm going to hand it over to Starr because she has a little more information about the Abbey Museum side of it and how they responded to a tribal request.
All right. So, how did the Abbey get involved in this project, and how did we start building a unique collaborative process through this experience? First, I really want to reiterate that this was a Mi'kmaq created and a Mi'kmaq centered project, and that the revitalization process itself was led by the Mi'kmaq community members and artists themselves. And when it comes to how the museum got involved, we knew from day one that it was really important to respect that authority that they had over their own project, and really important to respect that it was a community run endeavor. And what we wanted to do, no matter what, was to support in any way that would be helpful and that would be appropriate. So it was really important for us. And though we have, even with me being an Indigenous person, I'm not a Wabanaki person. I'm not a Mi'kmaq. And so, like, I really do need to understand and keep asking questions like, is this helpful and is this appropriate? Right. And I do represent. And work within a colonial museum, right? And so those questions are really important for museums to ask when we're considering working with tribal communities and understanding how we're going to develop our approach to collaboration. And the first thing, and Jennifer reiterated this the other day, but the first thing, we did was ask two really important questions. It was, what do you need from us? And how can we help you meet your goal, right? And that's those are two really important questions to ask when trying to build those relationships within tribal communities, and especially when a museum is helping within the community itself, right? Outside of the walls of the museum. But also, we had the goal truly of and we've had this goal for a while, but of breaking down those museum walls and making sure that this is a place where Wabanaki people um, have um, have voice and have shared decision making. And those of you who might be aware of the kind of initiatives that happen at the Abbey, we've really been trying to think about that more and more, and thinking about how collaboration can happen beyond just educational programming, beyond just what's physically out on display and physically on exhibit. Really thinking about new ways that we can think about collaboration. Uh, and I do think it's really important to notice that these weren't our goals. So when we asked like, how can we help you meet your goals, we were really focusing on the community goals themselves. And in the collaborative process, I've found it really essential to ask those questions, um, and and how we can be in better service to Wabanaki communities. Jennifer identified pretty quickly when those questions were asked a desire. The She identified that initially she wanted to tribal members to be able to travel to museums and visit with quill collections, because she knew that it would be really important for Mi'kmaq people to have access to and be in community with the ancestors and with the ancestors' artwork. Um, uh, but she also found at this point that the distance was quite prohibitive to many tribal citizens. And so we wanted to think of ways that we could make that distance less of a barrier to having access to the collections. And it was at this point that we offered to bring all of our Mi'kmaq quill collection up to the Aroostook Band of Mi'kmaq. Um, And for those in the audience who don't work in museums, that's like a really big deal for a museum to do something like that, to pack up everything in our collections, anything. Like we gave Jennifer the entire list of items, and we were like, pick as many as you want, and if you want them all, we're going to get them up there. And that's what we did. We packed them all up, including in the picture, you can see the high back dining chair, this really incredible piece that's actually out in display right now. But these really incredible ancestral items that we brought up, a 4.5 hour drive from the Abbey itself, in the back of a car. But we felt that this was something that was necessary. It was necessary for the group of working artists, and it was necessary for the ancestors themselves to be in community with other Mi'kmaq people on Mi'kmaq territory. A unique part of this collaboration was giving up that very traditional museum authority, in order to better serve the home community and the ancestors. And we did this by hosting um, on tribal land, in tribal council chambers at Mi'kmaq Nation, and by keeping the door open so that community members knew that they were welcome and encouraged to visit with the ancestors, and by having the ancestors actually stay overnight with the collections that are at a rustic band of Mi'kmaq, and to visit with other ancestral items. And reflecting back now, the approach to collaboration was all about building trust and not expecting anything in return for just doing the right thing. Um, and those building of relationships, that in and of itself is part of the work of museums. I really believe that. I believe that we can't do good work if we're not also working on building those relationships. And this was a really big part of the work that happened during this process. And later, just it's really blossomed since then. So, and I'm going to let Jennifer speak a little bit more about this idea of ceremony and the Abbey taking a back seat when the ancestral items were up at a rustic.
I have to remember to unmute myself. Um, when we approached the Abbey and we said, we know that you have our collections, we know that you have items that are Mi'kmaq, we know that they are quill items. Is it possible that we could get, just a few of them, or we could make a visit? And it was the Abbey staff that really stepped forward and said, would you like us to bring them to you? And being out of a museum, a traditional Eurocentric museum background, I was floored. And I said, yes, absolutely, we would. And once that agreement had been made with us and we worked out the details of how they were going to get there, who was going to be bringing them, what time the building would be open, how we would get these, where they would be stored overnight, how many locks had to be between the collections and, just the general world, the Abbey stepped back and they let us take over. And that was a crucial part to the success of this project. When these objects, and I kind of get choked up, so forgive me on this one. When those objects came home, some of them had not seen Mi'kmaq community and community members for 200 years. So we decided what would be important at that point in time was to welcome them home with ceremony. And our ceremony was guided by our tradition. And when we say Upjalazi, we are welcoming you. We are welcoming you to come in and treat our space as your space. And it was really important for us to acknowledge and welcome home the ancestors. Their energy is tied to those creations. And any artist will tell you that when they make a piece of art, they leave a little bit of their soul behind. And it was important for us to welcome our Mi'kmaq ancestors back in. So every day that we had this program, we would start it with a smudge and we would welcome them home with, it didn't have to be a big grandiose ceremony. It was private, it was intimate, it was us, it was the artisans working with these objects. And our very first time that the objects were brought in, they were laid out in the council chambers. And as Starr said, we left the door open. And we left the door open because we not only invited tribal members in, but we worked through our local libraries and we worked through our local university systems and we invited them. We invited the art students. We invited the history students. We invited the teaching students. We got all of those connections going. And what we did is we invited them in and they could attend as well. They could attend that first informative session of what the grant was about, how we were going to do it, and why these objects were here. So having the Abbey step back and allowing us to do what we needed to do and what we felt was right at the time was such a critical tipping point for this project's success, because we also allowed our tribal community members the opportunity to, with guidance, with instruction, with the gloves, we allowed them to pick up the objects and interact with them as curiosity seekers, as descendants of the artisans who had made these objects. And that is something that you don't find in a lot of museums, and you don't find that that kind of interaction. This was not a sterilized environment by any means whatsoever. It wasn't going into a collections room. We did not have a collections room at the time. It was not going into a collections room and looking at shelves and pointing things out and saying, well, here is this era and here is this era. This was actually laid out on our council chambers. And if you look at the slide, you can see how they were taken apart. Some of these things had been coming apart over the years, and the Abbey emphasized that with taking the lid and taking the rim of the lid and removing them from the rest of the box, so we could get a very up close and intimate look at these objects that our ancestors had created with their own hands. And that was incredibly important. Now, I know the community response to this was amazing, absolutely amazing. The folks who were curious, who had had an idea about it, were curious about quill work, had done quill work in the past, wanted to know more, or just wanted to know the art form from the ground up. They came in and they watched a slideshow and they got to interact with these objects. And we left the door open. And I cannot emphasize that enough. We physically and metaphorically left that door open for tribal employees to come in, non-native community members to come in, for tribal community members to come in. And Starr always chuckles when I tell this story, but Frank the cat, there was a Frank the cat episode. And Frank the cat, he's a res cat. He lives in the tribal housing, and Frank the cat goes everywhere. But Frank does not go into the buildings. He is known for not going into the buildings. And during our session, our informative session about the beginning of this project, somebody looked over and said, Frank's here. And then there was this murmur that went throughout the tribal community that was there. And it was heartily and quickly agreed upon that Frank's presence in the room meant the spirits had come to see what was going on. And so Frank was shushed out the door. Okay, we thanked Frank. Frank was thanked, and he was shushed out the door. And a couple minutes later, somebody turned around and said, Frank's back. Frank was shushed out the door 2 or 3 times that day, and Frank kept coming back. And all of a sudden, that conversation amongst tribal community members, all of a sudden it turned to, the ancestors approve of what we're doing. The spirits approve of what we are doing. Frank he keeps coming back because he's sent back. He is curious. He wants to know what's going on. And they feel the good medicine that surrounds this project, the good medicine around the intent. And that's my Frank the Cat story, but I love Frank the Cat. The other one that really came about that day was the identification of objects in the collection that were brought to us that were misidentified. One of the things that we find in museum collections is many Mi'kmaq artifacts are misidentified or they have missing information. So once we have all of these boxes, all of these beautiful quilled boxes out on the tribal council chambers, what happened was we started to closely look at them as community members, but also as community artisans. And we began to pick out similarities that had not been noted before. And I think one of the most important and critical pieces to come out of it that day was that we identified for the Abbey 2 boxes that were made by the same artisan in the same time period. And those happened to be the 2 oldest boxes in their collections. And those were 200 years old. We wanted to make sure that those boxes got together. So on the slide, you'll notice the 2 boxes, the round box and the square box. These 2 boxes we call sister boxes because it was the way the stitching was done. It was the design work. It was the color scheme. It was a myriad of different little things that added up to, we very quickly identified these and we agreed upon as a community base in that room that yes, these 2 items do belong together and they were made by the same person. This is the way that we could help the Abbey by bringing them their collection up to us. We could reciprocate with that kind of information, and the reciprocation will continue in throughout this process. It inspired community members. All of these boxes, having these around, inspired community members to develop their own art. And one of the things I loved so much when Tara, our instructor, was saying, if you get stuck, go see the ancestors. So during our workshops in this grant project, our artisans would kind of get stuck with, well, what can I do? What should I do? How do I make a piece my own? So Tara would always remind us, go see the ancestors. So one by one, we'd get up from the table. We would go and we would handle the boxes. Because during this process, during every workshop, the Abbey sent a person with several of the quilled items back to our community. So throughout the entire process, we were surrounded by the ancestor art, and we could refer back to it as often as we needed to while we learned the critical components of the technicality of stitching on leather, stitching on birch bark. So that was amazing. And holding the ancestors' art was a connection that none of us had ever had before, because we don't often see these things. The quilled boxes from the 1800s, the 1700s, the early 1900s were all often collected as souvenirs from people who were going on vacation. Very early on, they were collected by the English and the French as trade items, and they were in homes far away across the Atlantic. So to hold the art that was made 200 years ago was a profound experience for our community artisans. This whole idea really is summed up in the idea of meeting community members where we were at. And that is what the Abbey did for us. They met us where we were at with our needs, our desires, our plans, our goals, and our grant project. And they really let us drive the bus on this one. They did the back of the house work. They made sure the collections were safe. They made sure the collections were cared for, and they traveled the collections back and forth. And that was the part that we needed from the Abbey. And they really did a great job. as a reciprocal nature for the experience, because we are a reciprocal gift giving tribal culture. The Abbey did this incredible thing for us, and we wanted to give back to the Abbey. There was no spot in our grant for any money to go to the Abbey. We did cover the travel costs of the curator bringing the objects. We did cover the lodging for that person and the meals. But what we could not do is we had no space nor the funds to actually help the Abbey with their operating costs or anything beyond that. So what we did instead was we invited that curator to come into our workshops. This was a critical component. And I use that word a lot, critical, because there was so much that happened during this process that had never been done before. And each piece lent to an even more important piece that lent to an even more important aspect of what we were doing. So the reciprocal part of this was that we invited the Abbey staff member into our workshops. What that is inviting someone in, and during our workshops, that person heard our stories, heard our language, heard how we laugh during this process. That person was invited in to truly and wholly share in that cultural experience, which would not have been made available otherwise, because we wanted this person inside our experience of learning. We also wanted to give back, and that we are still working on what the end outcome of our shared experience I'm sorry, our shared experiences will be from this, and what will be a professional development product. So we really enjoyed inviting Abbey staff members. And when that staff member changed, we invited the next person that took their seat, their job or their job uh, duties over. And we said, we want to keep this going. We want to keep this relationship going with you and your staff members. So we invited the next person in, and that person happened to be Starr. And she is still invited to our community workshops when we sit down and learn even more stitches coming up. So I'm going to hand it over to Starr now, and she can talk a little bit more about the overall collaboration from the museum aspect of this.
So the continuation of this project, after those initial visits and after the classes themselves with the community members and being invited to be part of that, that continuation of the project was always meant to be within those classes. And Jennifer's community was really generous enough to extend those continued invitations to be part of that group and to learn along with them as they were learning new stitches and that theme of stitches. It obviously is within our title, but it was a really big part of the project, and so it was a really important process to witness and to be part of. And though COVID suspended those in-person meetings, Jennifer and I had time to reflect together on all of those classes and on the project, on the collaboration that happened and the transformational experiences that happened in that room between community and ancestors. And we thought that sharing these stories and those experiences and the art itself would be compelling and moving for an exhibit, and an exhibit at the Abbey specifically. Um, and so that birth of of the next iteration of that collaboration was kind of born, like it kind of came to be, it came into existence. We started kind of stitching together the idea of of the exhibit together. um and it all started in a very simple way, just by being conversation with each other. um but we wanted to ask some questions. How can we tell these stories and share the voices of the women who started that artists guild? In what ways can we do that very compellingly to the average visitor that comes into the Abbey Museum? And to me, it really felt like a natural progression of our collaboration, and it felt so important. And I felt really honored that Jennifer trusted me to help make this vision come to life, and to make this, or at least be part of this next step in the collaboration. Um, and as Jennifer will explain shortly, we kept running into certain roadblocks when trying to do research about older quill work, and running into um, a lot of biases that we were encountering within white academia, and knowing how much of this research is inaccurate, and quite frankly really harmful. We wanted to also provide a space to make sure that Micmac people and voices were prioritized over that of the dominant academics within the field. And one of our guiding themes throughout the exhibit is about reclaiming the narrative. You'll see that throughout the exhibit if you have a chance to come visit us. And it was a really useful way for us to discuss a whole bunch of different topics relating to history, relating to reclamation, relating to uh, Micmac oral traditions, all sorts of various topics. And there was this really incredible quote that I wanted to share. It's actually from the exhibit, and it's from Jennifer. um, and but I'd like to share it before handing it back over to Jennifer to speak a little bit more about the exhibit and the reclamation of motif and narrative. Jennifer said in one of her panels that to know how to read the visual language of our ancestors is to know our world. And it's such a powerful statement to say that, and I'll say it again because it's just so good. But to know how to read the visual language of our ancestors is to know our world. And that's what we wanted to give to the public. We wanted to give them a little peek into understanding that visual language. And Micmac quill work is a really great way to understand Micmac worldview, and to understand Micmac history. So I'm going to hand it back over to Jennifer to speak more.
Now, I don't want anybody to think for a minute this is dry. When we talk about in establishing relationships between the tribal community and Starr and the Abbey, this is me texting Starr during the research and saying, "You won't believe what I found this time. I can't believe this is a thing. Can you believe that this is actually a statement in academic papers?" We kept coming up against these challenges in some of our research about nameless motifs and just some of the absolutely absurd kind of observations that have been made by non-native academics, and even some by non-native academics that haven't crossed that line into more indigenous voice curation and have stayed in that very traditional type of text panel, very traditional museum type of record keeping. Even in some of the databases like Past Perfect doesn't necessarily meet our needs a lot of times. So a lot of that information was missing, and a lot of that information actually gets misinterpreted. So these things, like one of my pet peeves on this project was nameless motifs. This is just a thing. They're just Micmacs do geometric designs, and to lump it all under geometric designs is to miss the point entirely of our artwork. And it also ruins the credibility and legitimacy of us as a Micmac people. And it also ruins the credibility and legitimacy of our Micmac ancestors. Uh, Recognizing the motifs, we hear the ancestor voices. A lot of our questions when we were surrounded by our objects, this was, I see this, what do you see? And we had to pull on a lot of intergenerational knowledge in order to pull out some of the things that we had seen because they weren't necessarily documented very well. And some of those things, like in the slide right now, um, this is the back of the quilled dining chair, which was a very popular kind of artifact that was commissioned and purchased during the Victorian era. Sometimes sets of these chairs were created, 6 or 8 chairs at a time. They would also be paired with dining placemats, quilled placemats. And if you think about these chairs surrounding this old Victorian table and having all of these placemats, all also highly decorated in the same fashion, it would make a stunning conversation piece. But beyond that conversation piece, we went deeper, and what we started to see in this quilled back chair were lines of community members. This was a community that was standing before the mountain range when the sun rose, and that kind of morning, that sunrise ceremony, is something that we are very familiar with today, and we still practice. As a community, we still practice it at community gatherings like our Mawiomi, and which is our annual powwow. So this type of thing was very, very important for us to recognize. And once one thing was recognized, someone else in the community would recall her intergenerational knowledge and say, I recognize this. I recognize the thunderbirds. I recognize the clouds. I recognize the wigwams that are set up. I recognize the four directions and the doors to each of those directions. There's the eastern door, the western door. And it's very important for this intergenerational knowledge to be able to come out. So it no longer became a chair to us. It became a full-blown record of a Mi'kmaq community and our ideology. And that's really important when we recognize these motifs, to realize that our ideology was never lost. So many of the academic types of papers take a very generic look at our artifacts, and we are putting voice to those artifacts. And we were only able to do this because we could get that close to them. Now, we found that we needed to prioritize our tribal community voices, and we began reclaiming narratives. There were 3 really big academic narratives that we found constantly pushing back on us when we wanted to move this project forward. And one of those was that Mi'kmaq designs were devoid of meaning. They were just simply geometric designs. We just liked making triangles and boxes, stair steps, little dots. That's really what a lot of these narratives were telling us. And we knew that to be false. Another one that we kept coming up on was that we didn't learn this ourselves, that we learned all of this from other tribes. And that is a common narrative that I constantly run into in the museum world, in art history, in history itself, that we are learning this all from other tribes, which goes back to that idea of negating our existence, our ideas, and our creativity, as well as the ability to put our thoughts and processes into an art form. The third narrative was that quillwork was created only for the Europeans during the trade cycle. Once Europeans started coming over, we just made things that were quilled for them, but never for ourselves, which is completely erroneous. Because looking back into the French records, the French were the first to say that Mi'kmaq delegations coming to meet with us, they were adorned in white moose hide clothing. They had porcupine quilled garments. They had porcupine quilled headbands, girdles, arm guards. They had porcupine quills woven into their hair. And that porcupine quill became an identifier of Mi'kmaq people. And it kind of got lost, because with the amount of porcupine quill work that was traded in the 1600s, the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s. This means that the boxes that you see in collections is all people know about us. And there's so much more to that. And that was one of the things that we wanted to push back on in this exhibit, was reclaiming our own narratives. On the slide that you're looking at right now, this is about reclaiming that all quill work is culturally significant. It carries meaning, ancestral knowledge, and represents survival. This is directly our voice challenging the academic narrative that our designs were devoid of meaning. Everything we did meant something. Even Christian Leclerc, the very first French Jesuit that came to Mi'kmaq country in the very, very late 1500s, 1590s, actually, he sat down with Mi'kmaqs and he would sit across the fire and he would say, he would record this, and he recorded as much Mi'kmaq as he could. The problem was that he recorded it phonetically in French, so he could read it back later. So many people look at Mi'kmaq and they say, well, that's very French of you. And no, it's very Mi'kmaq, but it has a French influence to it because of that translation. And that happens in our artwork as well. There's a missing step in the translation because it gets translated for a Euro-American audience through a Euro-American lens. And that's one of the things that we wanted to push back a lot with this particular exhibit. So being able to explore those ideas of our ideology, of important things in our life, all goes back to something called ideograms. And Christian Leclerc was the first one to write down, when I sit across the fire from these Mi'kmaq people, they talk, they talk about these big ideas, and then they'll stop and they'll grab a piece of birch bark and they'll grab a charcoal from the fire and they begin scribbling on the birch bark. And what they do is they write these symbols. And what has incorrectly, again, through the Euro-American lens, what has incorrectly become termed as Mi'kmaq hieroglyphs are not actually hieroglyphs. They are ideograms. And knowing that, and knowing we had a traditionally cultural, meaningful expression of ideas in written format, it was not difficult to transfer that over into reading our ancestral art. And once we got through that barrier in our community, we really started to explore and see the messages that were coming out from our ancestors. So I'm going to send this back to Starr because she has a little bit more on that, with how the museum dealt with that as far as facing a tribal interpretation of our own artwork, and what the museum world expected and what the Abbey did to help us get our message across.
Yeah, and one of those things that were so important is the role that the ancestors played throughout the process, and also the the role of ancestors in the exhibit itself. Jennifer and I talked at length in the planning process. How do we talk about the ancestors in this exhibit? How do we how do we let the audiences really understand how important not only are the ancestors to Mi'kmaq people, but how important they were um, in the development of the artists at Mi'kmaq Nation, and how can we really express to people that the ancestors are in the room with them? How can we help the audiences understand that when the artists were working with these items from our collections, that they were actually in communication with the ancestors, that they were learning things from the ancestors as a result of interacting with these ancestral items. And so we we were planning out the layout of the exhibit, and we actually worked with another staff member, Angela Raup, who's in the education department, but she's also a really talented graphic designer, and she helped us design these silhouettes of the ancestors. And so we used these silhouettes of the uh, woman ancestor to help visitors understand that they are surrounded by the ancestors. But not only that, that the ancestors are right next to each of the working artists' profiles. And so we thought like we could do that in a very physical way to communicate that by actually having the ancestors present. I mean, and these are vinyl vinyl decals on the wall that are 6 feet tall. You know, like they're surrounding you. You can feel them, and they're there and they're present and they're next to each of the artists that are profiled in the exhibit. And not only did we want them physically there in that way, to have the ancestors in the exhibit on the walls, but we also thought, you know, we're profiling each of the women that were part of this guild, right? Part of this working group of artists. It's also important to actually give the ancestor their own panel because they're also a member, right? They're also part of that group. And so Jennifer did this really fabulous write up talking about this Micmac ancestor artisan, right? Because she is in all the work that's on display, and she is there with all of the artists. And many of the artists actually reference the ancestors as they're talking about the art and as they're talking about the experiences of being in this group. So it was really a really interesting exercise of how do you talk about ancestors with people that, for the most part, you know, a lot of our visitors are from white backgrounds and don't necessarily think about the ancestors all that much. So how can we do that for them? How can we talk about how important this is? I think it's also important to note that very early on, I wanted to ask Jennifer, you know, how should we identify the makers of each of these items? A lot of the times in museum labels, you'll see that it's either says like artist unknown or it'll be blank or something like that. And so we actually decided um, that each one would be identified as Micmac artist. We decided that it would actually say Micmac ancestor, um, where the artist name normally would be. And so that was a really important aspect of the show, as well as making that determination and committing to that, and to understanding that though the names might not be recorded in museum collections and records, um, that these people are known and are important, and so we need to at least identify them as ancestors and understand that these were real people that had real lives and um, had something to share um, with the next generations. Um, and
And I
I,
think it's,
yeah,
oh, I'm
go
sorry.
for it. No, please go for it because
We
I
knew that
think
was
this
going
is
to happen at
important.
some
Yeah.
point. And one of the other things that we wanted to come across too is that these are stories of survival. This is a critical time for federal Indian policy to be developed and carried out. This is also a lot of the time where these particular items in the collection were purchased from Micmac artisans. This is also a time where we are being put on reservations. We are being put on reserves in Canada. We are being sent to boarding schools. Our ancestors are being sent to boarding schools. And this falls very heavily into the survival aspect of our ancestral work. These stories that came out from reading this art, we could tell that we had continuity in our culture. We could tell some things had changed. We could tell that we at the heart of it are and always will be Micmac people. And that was really important for us as artisans. And I think the Abbey did a phenomenal job helping us relay those stories, that these were not just nameless, faceless people. And when we were invited to bring in this ancestor artisan kind of figure into the exhibit, it changed everything. So when you walk into this exhibit, it is not just coming in and looking at the pretty art. This is being invited into a circle of women. Quite literally, you are surrounded by these large vinyl Mi'kmaq female figures. Next to each of these figures is an artist's profile and our contemporary work samples next to us. We have a panel for our instructor, Tara, and she is the leader of what we were learning. So we wanted to honor her as well. She has such an important voice. And then we were fortunate enough to be able to obtain, or actually we weren't, the Abbey was fortunate enough to be able to obtain a couple of pieces, more contemporary pieces from Tara and a couple of other Mi'kmaq artisans like Ingrid Brooks and Melissa Peter Paul. So this was really how this idea had blossomed into much more than what you initially see when you come in. But we also wanted the exhibit to be very welcoming, and you are quite honestly being welcomed into the inner female artisan circle of a very traditional art form, usually performed by the women of the tribe. So this is a way of reciprocal gift giving for us too, because we are inviting you as, or anybody as non-Mi'kmaq people to come in and share in these ideas, our ideology, our survival, our ancestors, and our intergenerational stories, and where it's going next.
Well, thank you. And we are at 4:30, so we have 15 minutes for questions. And um, I do hope that we can take questions now. And I'm going to be checking the Q&A box. I just have to stop my share. Right. So, okay. Our first question that we have from the audience is about, they're asking, what has been the audience reception to this show so far? And I'll take that just since I, I work in the museum and I can speak a little bit to that definitely. The overwhelming response has been incredibly positive. We have found that people are spending more time in this exhibit than they normally spend in our exhibits, and really taking time to read each of the panels. People seem to be very connected to this topic and really interested in the conversations that each of the artists brings out in their profiles, and definitely very interested in the panels relating to reclaiming the narrative and pushing back um, on the more the traditional academic takes on Mi'kmaq quill work. Um, and I shared this the other day with Jennifer, but we did get some interesting feedback from um, a curator, and so there's this interesting idea that not only is the average audience member or visitor responding to this show, but we actually have people that uh, are involved with the museum or involved with museums that are also responding to this show. Um, and in particular, this person was very complimentary to us, and this came via email, was very complimentary to us, stated that they had been working in museums for decades, but they also would be very interested in recurating the show for us, and specifically citing things like the voice of the show, and specifically citing um, the first person perspective of this show. And Jennifer and I, we chatted about this in depth, and just thinking about what that meant for this curator to send a message like this. And after a lot of reflection, I realized that, um, this person probably would have never have offered to bring the quill work into the community in the first place, right? That this person is probably coming from like a very traditional museum background where the collection comes first and people can come second, and that's not the point of this museum, and that's not the point of this show, and that's not the point of what we were trying to accomplish with this collaboration. So there was a lot to think about and a lot of discussion that was happening between Jennifer and I as we were thinking about that particular response to this show. And I do think that it really shows um, the kind of work that we want to continue to kind of move away from. And I don't know if Jennifer, if you want to like add anything else about your response to that particular feedback, but yeah.
Well, it was very interesting to see another professional curator's take on another curator's work, and I did not take it personally. It's going to happen. It's just going to happen, particularly when you're working for advocating other Native people's art and opinion. It is a cultural divide. So I'm not going to say I didn't drive home that day and murmur to myself, she wants to rewrite my exhibit. That's I'm not going to say I didn't do that. But you and I had talked, Starr, about this at great length, and we both agree. We had an opinion. We knew this was going to happen going into it, and we also welcome the other voice, because the other voice coming in from the more traditional museum field, saying that's not written correctly, your text panels are not supposed to use that voice, you're supposed to use this voice, I could write it better. That also showed us, and we agreed upon that when we spoke, that it showed us where the work is that we have to do. That not only do we have these academic pushbacks, these narrative pushbacks that are happening, but we also have these professional pushbacks as well. And that is critical to know where the pain points are when you're trying to re-indigenize the message of a tribal collection for the public.
We have another question. If you had additional funding or time, what would you like to do next to build on this work and to transfer and sustain other cultural traditions, skills, and art forms? And I'm definitely going to let Jennifer take that on because that's a good that's a good
Um,
question.
I love this question, and thank you so much for asking it. If we had additional funding and time, I mean that. It's not an and or thing, it's a funding and time. And I think the pandemic has proven that to us, that across the globe, quite literally, if you have the time to do something, you're going to do it. But if you don't have the funding in order to do it, then you're hampered, you're hobbled. And I think what we would like to do next, and something that we did not get to do that was part of our grant package, was before the pandemic hit, we had said we're going to let everybody self-select out of this program. The people at the end of this series of workshops are going to be our core group of quillwork artisans. And our plan was to take these artisans to Halifax, Nova Scotia, to a museum that has the largest repository of Mi'kmaq quillwork in the world. And there are some stunning examples. And that was going to be the reward for the hard work, the commitment to the project, the commitment to their art form, is that we were going to go get a close-up look of that collection, where we would never be able to do that before. Quite frankly, in the United States, our collection is spread all over the world. So that's what we would do if we had funding and time for that. And we would also sustain this tradition. This is a step. This is a first step in how cultural resources can be managed. And we would utilize this as a template to go ahead and do other things, work with the basket making community and help revitalize. Not that it's not vibrant right now, but it's very difficult for master artisans to get new folks involved and get apprentices. And maybe we could utilize this particular model to do that with other art forms in our community, particularly the traditional art forms that we don't see a lot of artisans practice today.
And then we have another question. Are there other museums also evolving to give narrative to ancestors and the community? Um, and this person might be referring specifically to your experiences, Jennifer, and your community. So I don't know if you've had other experiences with museums that have done something similar like this, but I could certainly speak of other museums that I know that are doing incredible work. But if you wanna answer that.
I don't have a whole lot to say about this one, Starr. I thank you for very much. I really do appreciate the compliment, and I'm going to speak for Starr for just a second. Thanks. We really appreciate that you think this is a brilliant example of honoring the maker, and it's not something that personally I've seen before. This was really stepping out into, at least for our community. Maybe it's been done for other communities, but it has not been done for our community in this way with this art form prior to this. This was taking a leap. This was putting our voice first and knowing that we were going to get the pushback from it and doing it anyway, because it was culturally important for us to have those unknown people, those unknown artisans, because in our culture, we know we are not who we are today all on our own. We do walk with thousands of ancestors running through our blood, and we wanted to honor that. So this was a very new thing for us, and even something that hasn't been done in our own tribal exhibits to this point. We The museum portion got disrupted again due to COVID and due to a change in position. So it's something that I actually look forward to our own tribal exhibit doing as well, now that we have this great example and feedback from it. But Starr, if you wanted to take over some of the examples that you know and the work that other museums are doing, that'd be great.
Um, there's some really incredible work that I know that's going on. Um, it's not a museum, but it is um, a working collection down at the School of Advanced Research in Santa Fe. There's some really incredible work that they're doing that I always try to champion and talk about with people. Um, I also know that there's some pretty incredible work that's also happening at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. Um, and then also, I know that the Museum of Us, formerly the Museum of Man, has been working really hard on their decolonization initiative and really thinking about consent in a really interesting way, especially as it relates to ancestors and whether or not they consent to have certain things on display. And specifically, I am thinking about ancestral remains in this case. So there are definitely some good things that are happening, and I hope that it grows more as we really push people to think about this more critically. Um, yeah. Um, there's a really interesting question, Jennifer. It seems that being in the presence of these objects and the ancestors is crucial to understanding this exhibit. Is there any benefit to sharing access to these items via the web? And if so, what would the benefits be?
For for this exhibit, it's important to understand our community viewpoint of the ancestors. And while it is important for this physical exhibit to give that ancestral presence there and that understanding, it's really a constant reminder, but it's a very low key reminder that this was brought on by people before us, and that's what was important. There is definitely a benefit to sharing access to these objects via the web, because we have this base, we have this pilot project now that we have completed, and it has never been done in this way before. This is a groundbreaking um, project that we did and we are continuing with. We are here as resources. So sharing this across the web or in classrooms um, also could include that conversational component. And that's something that teachers can do, academics can do, is bring in that ancestral voice component that we have outlined in this exhibit. We didn't share state secrets. We shared our ancestors, we shared our heritage, we shared the pieces that we felt were most important. And we think that by doing so, even with a slideshow or a virtual walk through the exhibit, if you will, that can still be of benefit as long as those ancestral voices are maintained by the narrator of the program. So, and of course, we're, like I said, we're always here to answer questions and help with that too.
This is going to be our last question. How do you advocate for Indigenous artists and art when you receive pushback from others? It's really hard out here for Indigenous women in museums and academia. And it definitely is. And um, it's hard to give advice, just not knowing exactly what kind of institution anybody's working in, or your experiences. But when it comes to advocating, I always say, just never stop advocating, and really think within your circles and your circles of influence, because we all have these kind of spheres of influence. And even if we're not very far along in our career, if we're just beginning, like, we can still influence people around us and help change minds. And by continuing to push back, and that's what we're trying to do even in this exhibit, is to push back on that, and in little ways, in big ways, whatever we can do. It's about the ancestors, and it's about our communities, and it's about our voices. And so it's really important that we never stop advocating, for our Indigenous artists, and for the art forms themselves. And Jennifer, if you want to add anything else, go.
The only thing I want to add to that is that when that kind of question comes up about how do we advocate, uh, I think of my great aunt. And my great aunt was a very strong Mi'kmaq woman. She did beadwork, she did basketry, she did fancy baskets, she fished, she hunted. She was just as at home in her flannels and her waders as she was dressed up going to church. And I remember her resiliency. And I remember that she stayed true to herself. And that's one of the things that I try to emulate and remember, that I am of her and I am of her blood. And I need to make just as a strong a showing to academia, to the public, that I need to honor her strength and honor her work, as much as I honor my own, as much as I honor my grandparents' work. Um, I need to maintain, and to maintain the message is the most important thing I think we can do to advocate for artisans, and in academia, is to maintain our voices, that we don't waver, that we say the message that we need to say, and we say it until someone hears us, and we just keep moving forward that way.
And that does bring us to the end of this program. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We have been recording, and we will be sharing this out later. But thank you so much for being here and for learning more about this process and about the exhibit. We really hope that you can come visit us in person. Um, but we do have more resources online. There are some really excellent videos that Jennifer recorded as part of the exhibit that are available on our YouTube page as well, in which she talks about some really important topics around quill work. So please visit our website, visit the YouTube page for more information if you want to learn more. Thank you so much. And Jennifer, do you want to sign us off?
Well, there is no word for goodbye in Mi'kmaq, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to thank everybody. So Wallalan, for coming today and for hearing our message and for being open to continuing our work. And I do hope that I get to work with Tara again and Starr and continue the process of bringing our message of cultural survival and our artwork forms to the public. And because there's no word for goodbye, we have a word that means I will see you again, and that is opnamultis.